My mother-in-law screamed in my face, telling me to get my screaming babies out of her immaculate house. My own husband shoved me into the freezing Chicago snow while his family watched in disgust. They thought they were throwing out a worthless freelance web designer who had nowhere to go. They had no idea that the woman they just discarded was about to buy their entire world and tear it down. Before I tell you how I exacted my revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws who underestimated your worth. The wails of my 1-month-old twins, Amari and Aria, echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the suburban Chicago living room. I was trying to bounce both of them at once, feeling the exhaustion in my bones. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, marched into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She snatched my faded canvas diaper bag from the pristine white sofa and hurled it onto the floor, spilling baby bottles and wipes everywhere. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the front door. "Hurry up and take those loud babies out of here right now," she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Get them out before they ruin everything. Preston and his parents will be here any minute. They are legacy money from Boston, and I absolutely will not have my daughter's wealthy in-laws walk in to see my son's wife looking like a homeless web designer holding screaming infants. You are an embarrassment to this family's image." I looked at her, clutching my babies to my chest. Beatrice was the head of the women's ministry at her megachurch, constantly preaching about grace and family values. But behind closed doors, she was obsessed with status and appearances. I turned to my husband Julian, hoping he would step in and defend his wife and his newborn children. Julian was a junior lawyer desperately trying to claw his way up to partner. He walked into the room adjusting his expensive tie, but his eyes held no warmth. Instead of defending me, Julian grabbed my arm and shoved me toward the hallway. I stumbled, barely catching my balance to protect Amari. And Arya, Julian glared at me, his face flushed with anger. "I told you to clean yourself up and keep them quiet," he hissed. "Preston is bringing his family's venture capital fund managers tonight. This is my chance to secure the investment for my own firm and elevate my career. Are you trying to destroy my one shot at real wealth? Get out of here before you ruin my life." Before I could even process the physical shove, my sister-in-law Alicia glided down the grand staircase. Following close behind her was her husband, Preston. Preston was a white finance bro who married into our black family and was treated like absolute royalty by Beatrice because of his supposed old money pedigree. He was rubbing his temples with an exaggerated sigh of annoyance, acting as if our mere presence was an unbearable burden. "Julian, mate, you have to do something about this noise," Preston complained, waving a hand in my direction. "I am trying to take a highly sensitive conference call with my investors in London, and those kids are completely killing my focus. I cannot operate in this kind of chaotic environment. You need to handle your household." Alicia stepped forward, crossing her arms and looking me up and down with pure disdain. "Seriously, Gabrielle," she scoffed, eyeing my comfortable nursing clothes. "You look completely pathetic. You are just a cheap freelance coder who brought absolutely nothing to the table. Julian bought you that ugly Honda outside and put a roof over your head, and you cannot even manage to keep your kids quiet for one important evening. Take your trash and get out so the real adults can do business." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air, but my husband did not even flinch at the disrespect. Julian grabbed my winter coat from the rack, shoved it into my hands, and opened the heavy oak front door. A blast of freezing Chicago winter wind whipped into the foyer. Without another word, Julian pushed me out onto the snow-covered porch. I stood there, barefoot in my slippers, clutching my crying twins, as the heavy front door slammed shut right in my face. The lock clicked loudly, sealing me out. The icy wind bit into my skin, but the coldness in my heart was far worse. I carefully carried my crying babies down the slippery driveway to the old beat-up Honda Julian had bought me years ago. I secured Amari and Arya into their car seats, wrapping my coat around them to keep them warm. I started the engine and cranked the heater on high until their crying finally faded into soft, sleepy hiccups. I did not break down. I did not shed a single tear. I sat in the driver's seat and stared back at the brightly lit house where my husband and his family were eagerly awaiting their wealthy savior. They truly believed I was just a penniless, struggling web designer who depended entirely on their charity to survive. They thought I was weak. I reached into the hidden compartment of my bag and bypassed my regular wallet. Instead, I pulled out a sleek, heavy titanium Centurion card that caught the dim light of the street lamp. I picked up my phone and dialed a private number I had kept secret from Julian for the entirety of our marriage. A crisp, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Good evening, Madam Chairman." I kept my eyes locked on the glowing windows of my mother-in-law's house. "Activate the liquidation protocol," I said, my voice dead calm. "Suspend the anonymous capital injections to Preston's venture fund immediately and revoke every single line of credit attached to Julian's accounts tonight. Burn it all straight to the ground." "Understood," the voice replied. "Shall I prepare the penthouse for your arrival?" "Yes," I said, putting the car in drive. "We are going to my real home." Morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, illuminating 4,000 square feet of flawless Italian marble and sweeping views of Lake Michigan far below. The freezing Chicago snowstorm that Julian had shoved me into just hours ago felt like a distant nightmare from this height. Inside the climate-controlled nursery, Amari and Aria slept peacefully in matching custom mahogany cribs, completely unaware of the cruelty their father had shown them the night before. I stood at the kitchen island, wrapping my hands around a warm ceramic mug of coffee, when the jarring vibration of my phone shattered the quiet morning. It was a barrage of text messages from Julian, followed by a venomous voice note. I tapped the screen and let his arrogant voice fill the kitchen. "Gabrielle, you have exactly until noon to bring that Honda back to my mother's house." Julian sneered through the speaker, his tone dripping with the same condescending authority he used when speaking to a disobedient child. "You took a vehicle registered in my name, and that is theft. I am filing for divorce this morning, and you are going to surrender every piece of marital property we have. Do not even think about fighting me on this. I am on the partner track at the best law firm in the city, and I know judges who will gladly hand me full custody of the twins by Friday. You have absolutely no money, no job, no home, and you are clearly mentally unstable. Bring the car back, and maybe I will let you have supervised visitation." I deleted the message and set the phone face down on the counter. A cold smile touched my lips. Julian was so blinded by his own ambition and his desperate need to impress his wealthy white brother-in-law Preston that he never bothered to actually look at the woman he married. He truly believed I was nothing but a pathetic, struggling freelance web designer who spent her days making cheap websites for pennies. He never bothered to ask what I was actually coding down in the damp basement of our starter home while he was out buying expensive cigars to impress Preston. The private elevator chimed, signaling an arrival. The polished chrome doors slid open and Marcus stepped into the foyer. Marcus was not just a lawyer, he was a senior partner at the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the country. He walked in carrying his signature black leather briefcase, completely unfazed by the breathtaking luxury of the penthouse. "Good morning," Gabrielle, Marcus said, taking a seat at the kitchen island and snapping his briefcase open. "I have excellent news to start your day. The acquisition protocol initiated last night went off without a single hitch. Tech Global officially finalized the purchase of your user interface accessibility application at 8 o'clock this morning." He slid a thick bound document across the marble counter. I picked up the heavy silver pen he offered and signed on the dotted lines, sealing a deal I had spent 5 agonizing years building. My app, which revolutionized how visually impaired users navigate digital spaces, was no longer just a passion project. It was the property of a global tech giant. "The wire transfer cleared 20 minutes ago." Marcus continued, his voice smooth and deeply satisfying. $150 million has been deposited into your private offshore trust. After taxes and our firm fees, you are officially operating with a net worth that puts your husband's entire law firm to shame. I looked at the confirmation receipt. $150 million. Julian had kicked me out into the snow because he thought I would ruin his chance to secure a miserable venture capital investment from Preston. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, had treated me like garbage because I did not wear designer labels or brag about a fake pedigree. They worshipped money and status to the point of sickness. Now I held more liquid capital than Beatrice's beloved megachurch and Preston's supposedly elite family combined. I played Julian's voice note for Marcus. We both listened to my husband threaten to leave me destitute and steal my newborn babies. Marcus did not even flinch. He simply let out a low, humorless laugh and shook his head. It is almost poetic how utterly clueless he is, Marcus said, adjusting his glasses. Your husband thinks he holds all the cards. He thinks he can crush you in family court because he assumes you cannot afford a retainer. But Gabrielle, there is something else we need to discuss. Something far more serious than a delusional divorce threat. Marcus pulled a second, much thinner folder from his briefcase. Its bright red tab indicated high priority. The firm conducted a deep dive forensic audit of your marital assets last night to prepare for the divorce proceedings. Marcus explained, his tone shifting from celebratory to deadly serious. We needed to map out exactly what Julian legally owns. During the sweep, we uncovered a massive financial anomaly attached to your primary residence. He slid a copy of a bank document toward me. It was a secondary mortgage agreement for the small suburban house Julian and I shared. I scanned the terms and my blood instantly ran cold. The loan was for $1 million. I never signed this, I said, staring at the bottom of the page. That is my name, but I never authorized a second mortgage. I have not been to that bank in 3 years. I know, Marcus said grimly. Julian forged your signature. He bypassed the notary requirement by using a colleague at his law firm to stamp it illegitimately. Your husband committed federal mortgage fraud to pull $1 million in cash out of your home. The sheer audacity of Julian's crime made my head spin. Why would he take out $1 million loan without telling me, I asked, trying to piece the puzzle together? Where did the cash go? Marcus flipped to the next page, revealing a wire transfer receipt. It went directly into a corporate holding account registered to your brother-in-law, Preston. Julian took the money he stole from your home's equity and sank every last penny into Preston's venture capital fund. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Julian had been so desperate to sit at the big table, so eager to be accepted by Preston and validated by Beatrice, that he risked federal prison. He gambled the roof over his newborn babies' heads just to buy his way into his brother-in-law's fake elite inner circle. He sold out his own family for a seat next to Preston. Julian threatened to destroy me in court over a beat-up Honda, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as I stared at the forged signature. He threatened to take my children because he thinks I am poor. Marcus closed the red folder and folded his hands over it. Federal wire fraud and mortgage forgery carry a mandatory minimum sentence of up to 30 years, Gabrielle. Julian just handed you the key to his absolute destruction. How do you want to play this? I looked out the window at the sprawling Chicago skyline glittering under the winter sun. I thought about Beatrice fake crying at her church about my supposed mental breakdown. I thought about Alicia laughing at my clothes. I thought about Julian pushing me into the freezing night. We do not go to the police yet, I said, turning back to Marcus with a smile that felt completely foreign to my own face. We let Julian think he is winning. We let him think he is about to become a rich partner at his law firm. Let them all believe their little venture capital dream is coming true. I want them standing on the highest pedestal possible before I kick the legs out from under them. Sunday morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt entirely alien compared to the chaos of the past few days. Amari and Arya were asleep in the adjacent nursery, and I sat at the kitchen island nursing a fresh cup of coffee. Marcus was already pacing the length of my living room with his phone pressed to his ear, coordinating with my private security team and wealth managers. We had spent the weekend mapping out every financial thread connecting Julian to Preston. The trap was set, but patience was required to spring it perfectly. I opened my laptop and navigated to the official website for Greater Fellowship Sanctuary. It was the prominent black megachurch on the south side, where Beatrice served as the highly visible and incredibly vocal head of the women's ministry. Greater Fellowship was not just a place of worship for Beatrice. It was her personal stage. She thrived on the social currency that came with her position sitting in the front pews, judging the outfits of other congregants, and making sure everyone knew her family was supposedly rubbing elbows with elite Boston investors. The church boasted a congregation of thousands, complete with a state-of-the-art broadcast system, massive LED screens flanking the pulpit, and a highly aggressive digital fundraising team. I knew exactly what Beatrice would do today. She could never let a personal crisis go to waste without spinning it into a public relations victory. The live stream buffered for a moment before filling my screen with the high-definition broadcast of the sanctuary. The choir had just finished their opening numbers, and the senior pastor stepped aside to invite Beatrice to the podium for a special family announcement. She walked up the carpeted steps, wearing a flawless lavender designer suit, complete with a matching fascinator hat. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium and bowed her head, letting a heavy, suffocating silence fall over the massive room. When she finally looked up, her face was a masterclass in theatrical sorrow. Church family, I come before you today with a heavy heart. Beatrice began, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. The congregation murmured in immediate sympathy. The camera zoomed in tight on her face, capturing the single tear she allowed to slip down her cheek. As many of you know, my son Julian has dedicated his life to being a pillar of this community. He is a righteous man, a hard-working lawyer, and a devoted father. But the devil works hardest against those who walk in the light. I took a slow sip of my coffee watching her perform. Marcus stopped pacing and stepped behind my chair, crossing his arms as he watched the screen over my shoulder. Late Thursday night tragedy struck our home. Beatrice continued gripping a lace handkerchief. My daughter-in-law Gabrielle suffered a severe mental break. The pressures of motherhood were simply too much for her fragile mind. Without warning, she abandoned her husband. She fled into the freezing night, leaving Julian completely devastated and desperate to find his newborn twins. We do not know where she went or who she is with, but we fear she has fallen into a deep, dark psychosis. Marcus let out a sharp breath of disbelief. He leaned closer to the screen, watching the congregation gasp and place their hands over their hearts. She is actually standing in front of thousands of people claiming you abandoned your family, Marcus said, his voice thick with lawyerly outrage. She threw you into a snowstorm, and now she is playing the victim. Oh, it gets better, I replied calmly. Just wait for the pitch. Beatrice wiped her eyes, dabbing carefully so as not to ruin her makeup. My son is fighting a battle no man should have to fight alone, Beatrice cried, her voice rising an octave to reach the back of the sanctuary. He is working day and night with private investigators and the best legal minds in the city to rescue those innocent babies from an unstable environment. But the legal fees to fight for custody against a woman who has lost her mind are astronomical. We need to surround Julian with a hedge of protection. We need to build a spiritual and financial defense fund to bring Amari and Arya back to their rightful home. The screens behind her instantly shifted from peaceful stained glass graphics to a giant QR code and a direct link to the church's digital giving platform. The text on the screen read, Julian Wilson Custody Defense Fund. She was literally using my children to crowdsource money to cover the fraudulent debt Julian owed. The sheer audacity of the grift was almost impressive. Marcus pulled a legal pad from his briefcase and began writing furiously. Defamation per se, he stated firmly. Slander, public endangerment, and fraudulent solicitation. Gabrielle. I can have a cease and desist filed before their closing prayer. We can sue her and the church for millions. She is destroying your character on a public broadcast. Do you want me to draft the injunction right now? I reached out and placed my hand over his pen, stopping his writing. I shook my head, keeping my eyes locked on Beatrice's weeping face on the screen. No, I said softly. We do absolutely nothing to stop her. Marcus looked at me as if I had lost my mind. She is soliciting funds based on a vicious lie, Gabrielle. She is painting you as a negligent mother to thousands of influential people in this city. Exactly, I replied. And if we sue her right now, we look like the aggressors. People like Beatrice operate on sympathy and victimhood. If a high-powered law firm silences her, she will claim she is being persecuted by the very demons she warned them about. She wants to be a martyr. Let her be a martyr. Let her build this beautiful, towering pedestal of lies. The higher she builds it, the harder she will hit the ground when the truth comes out. But she is collecting money, Marcus argued, pointing at the screen where a live ticker showed donations pouring in from sympathetic churchgoers. $50 here, $100 there. They were funding Julian's fraud without even knowing it. I pulled my phone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. I opened the browser and navigated directly to the church's digital giving portal. I selected the option for the Julian Wilson Custody Defense Fund. The website had a feature designed to encourage large donations. Any gift over $5,000 triggered an automatic celebratory graphic on the main LED screens in the sanctuary, displaying the donor's name and a custom message of support. It was a vanity feature Beatrice herself had insisted on implementing to encourage the wealthy members to show off their generosity. I tapped the screen, selecting the anonymous donor option so my name would not appear. Then I moved to the donation amount. I bypassed the suggested tiers and typed in $10,000. What are you doing? Marcus asked, watching my fingers fly across the screen. I am giving my mother-in-law exactly what she asked for, I replied. I scrolled down to the custom message box. The prompt asked for a message of prayer or encouragement for Julian. I tapped the keyboard and carefully typed a single sentence. I linked my titanium centurion card and hit the submit button. On my laptop screen, Beatrice was still at the podium thanking the congregation for their beautiful generosity. Suddenly, a bright gold banner flashed across the massive LED screens directly behind her head. It was the alert for a premium donation. The congregation erupted into loud cheers and applause, seeing the $10,000 amount flash in bold numbers. Beatrice turned around to look at the screen, a wide, triumphant smile breaking through her fake tears. She clearly believed Preston or one of his wealthy associates had just bailed them out. She raised her hands in victory, ready to claim the blessing. Then the custom message loaded below the dollar amount, in massive glowing white letters for every single person in the 2,000-seat auditorium to read. For the twins you left in the snow. The cheers in the sanctuary died instantly. A heavy, confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Beatrice froze, her hands still raised in the air. The camera caught the exact moment her triumphant smile shattered into absolute raw panic. She stared at the words, her face draining of all color. She looked wildly toward the sound booth, frantically waving her hands for them to cut the feed, but the message remained frozen on the screen, a glaring neon reminder of her cruelty. I closed my laptop and took another sip of my coffee. The coffee tasted absolutely perfect. The fallout from Beatrice's livestream disaster was still making waves across Chicago elite circles when Monday morning arrived. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my master suite, examining my reflection. Gone were the faded nursing tops and comfortable leggings of the exhausted woman Julian had discarded. In their place was a custom-tailored crimson wool suit that fit me with lethal perfection. I slipped on a pair of black stiletto pumps and grabbed my vintage leather tote. Today was the day Julian and his arrogant brother-in-law Preston were scheduled to pitch their fraudulent venture capital fund to Vanguard Apex Capital. They had no idea that Vanguard Apex was the very firm that had quietly backed my accessibility app from its inception, and that my recent sale had made me their largest individual stakeholder. The lobby of the Vanguard Apex building was a sprawling masterpiece of brushed steel and tinted glass, located right in the heart of the financial district. I walked through the revolving doors, feeling the hum of power vibrating through the marble floors. The air smelled of expensive espresso and crisp winter mornings. Just a few yards away, standing near the guest reception desk, were Julian and Preston. Preston was adjusting his expensive silk tie, exuding that specific brand of unearned confidence that only came from generational wealth and white privilege. He was loudly boasting to the receptionist about his Boston pedigree, expecting her to fawn over his last name. Julian stood beside him, clutching his leather portfolio, sweating slightly, but nodding along with desperate eagerness. He was banking his entire legal career and his freedom on this single pitch meeting, using the $1 million he stole from my home equity as his buy-in. I walked purposefully across the lobby, my heels clicking a steady, commanding rhythm against the polished stone. Julian spotted me first. His eyes widened in shock before instantly narrowing into a glare of absolute disgust. He nudged Preston, who turned and looked me up and down with a condescending sneer. Julian marched right up to me, blocking my path to the security gates. "What on earth are you doing here?" Gabrielle, Julian hissed, keeping his voice low but laced with venom. "Did you honestly follow us here to make a scene? I told you I froze your accounts. If you are here to beg for money because you cannot feed the twins, you are wasting your time. My mother's church is already collecting donations to save my children from you, so just turn around and walk away." Preston chuckled, stepping up beside him and looking at my tailored suit with pure amusement. "Let me guess," Preston mocked, crossing his arms. "You found out Vanguard Apex is hiring low-level IT support, and you scraped together your last pennies to buy a knockoff suit. Gabrielle, this is a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. They do not hire freelance web designers who work out of their damp basements. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing my family. Get out of here before I have security throw you out." Julian leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. "You are pathetic," he whispered. "Take your little coding resume and go find a job at a strip mall help desk. The real adults are about to do high-level business and secure our future. You are nothing but a distraction." I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself or mention the millions sitting in my offshore accounts. I simply looked at the two men who had treated me like dirt and offered them a serene, brilliant smile. The kind of smile that only comes from knowing you hold the detonator to their entire world. "Good luck with your pitch, gentlemen," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "I hear the executives here are incredibly particular about who they invest with." Before Julian could spit out another insult, the chief of building security approached us. He completely ignored Julian and Preston, offering me a respectful bow. "Right this way, Madam Chairman," the security chief said, extending a hand toward a set of frosted glass doors that bypassed the regular security checkpoints. I walked past my stunned husband and his brother-in-law without a backward glance. The frosted doors slid open to reveal the private executive elevator, a lift strictly reserved for board members and primary stakeholders. I stepped inside and turned around to face the lobby. As the heavy steel doors began to close, I saw the sheer confusion washing over Julian's face. He was trying to process why the lowly freelance coder he threw out in the snow was being treated like royalty in the most powerful building in Chicago. The doors clicked shut, sealing his bewildered face out of my sight. On the 45th floor, the boardroom of Vanguard Apex Capital was a terrifying expanse of polished mahogany and panoramic city views. I sat in an adjoining private observation room, watching the main conference table through a wall of one-way glass. A small speaker on the desk pumped the audio feed directly into my quiet room. Julian and Preston were ushered into the boardroom by an assistant. They sat down across from three senior partners. The lead investor was a notoriously ruthless man named Sterling, who had mentored me through the early stages of my tech startup. Sterling did not even offer them a handshake. He simply stared at Preston with eyes like chips of flint. Preston launched into his pitch, completely oblivious to the freezing temperature of the room. He leaned back in his leather chair, relying heavily on his family name, dropping references to his father's Boston connections, and assuring the partners that his new fund was guaranteed to generate massive returns. He presented the $1 million in seed capital, the money Julian had stolen through mortgage fraud, as proof of their strong initial backing. He spoke for 10 agonizing minutes, relying entirely on empty buzzwords and unearned swagger, while Julian nodded along like a desperate lapdog trying to look like a visionary. Sterling let Preston finish his rambling speech. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Sterling picked up the glossy presentation file Preston had slid across the table. He did not even bother to open the cover. "Mr. Blackwell," Sterling began, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that commanded the entire room. I have sat through thousands of pitches in my career. I can say with absolute certainty that this is one of the most poorly constructed, financially hollow, and legally questionable proposals I have ever seen. You have zero proprietary technology, no sustainable revenue model, and your seed capital appears to be sourced from a single highly irregular residential mortgage withdrawal. Preston's arrogant smile vanished instantly. The color drained from Julian's face as the mention of the residential mortgage hit the air. Julian knew exactly what that meant. Wait, now let us be reasonable here, Preston stammered, sitting forward and trying to activate his usual charm. My family name alone brings immense value to this partnership. We are offering you a ground floor opportunity to work with legacy money. Sterling tossed the thick, glossy file back across the mahogany table. It slid hard and stopped right at Julian's fingertips. We are not interested in your family name, Sterling said, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. In fact, we are terminating this meeting immediately. Our primary shareholder personally reviewed your financials this morning. She advised us that your fund is absolute garbage and that any association with you would be a toxic liability to this firm. Julian frowned, looking down at the file and swallowing hard. Who is your primary shareholder? He asked, his voice trembling with a sudden inexplicable panic. Sterling did not answer. He simply nodded at the glossy folder. Julian looked closer. Stamped directly onto the bottom corner of the heavy presentation folder placed there by my personal assistant before the meeting began was a sleek silver logo. It was an intricate, abstract design of a geometric eye, the exact same logo that sat on the home screen of the accessibility application I had coded in his basement for 5 years. The very app he told me was completely worthless. Julian's eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered horror as he stared at the symbol. He finally realized that the woman he discarded, the woman he thought was a penniless nobody, was the primary shareholder of the firm that just crushed his entire future. I was still sitting in the observation room at Vanguard Apex, watching the color drain from my husband's face through the one-way glass when my phone began to vibrate against the mahogany desk. The caller ID flashed my sister-in-law, Alicia's name. I let it ring twice before answering, enjoying the quiet hum of absolute control. Before I could even say hello, Alicia's shrill voice assaulted my ear. "You selfish, spiteful little witch!" she screamed, her voice vibrating with a rage so intense it sounded like she was hyperventilating. Preston just called me from the lobby of Vanguard Apex. He is completely devastated. He said you stalked them to their meeting and deliberately stood in the lobby projecting your toxic, miserable energy just to throw off his pitch. You ruined everything, Gabrielle. They lost the funding because of you. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the ceiling and marveling at the sheer depth of their delusion. Preston had just been told his business model was garbage by one of the most ruthless venture capitalists in Chicago, but his fragile ego could not handle the rejection. Instead of admitting he was a fraud, he called his wife and blamed the entire failure on the bad vibes of his estranged sister-in-law standing near the elevators. "That is a fascinating theory, Alicia," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Did Preston happen to mention who the primary shareholder of Vanguard Apex is?" "I do not care about some faceless corporate shareholder," she shrieked, cutting me off completely. "I care that my husband's legacy is being delayed because you cannot handle seeing real success. You bring absolutely nothing to this family but poverty and embarrassment. Julian told me he is freezing your accounts today, but that is not enough. You owe us. You owe Preston an apology, and you owe my brother for every dime he wasted on you. I want that old Honda he bought you back in my driveway by 3 o'clock today. You can walk back to whatever homeless shelter you crawled into." I smiled, tapping my manicured nails against the desk. "You want the Honda back?" I asked, feigning a tone of defeat. "Yes," she demanded, huffing breathlessly into the receiver. "I am hosting the Oak Ridge Estates Spring Block Party this afternoon. The entire Homeowners Association board is here. I want you to drive that rusty piece of junk to my house, hand me the keys in front of everyone, and apologize for disrespecting my husband. Consider it your first installment of paying back this family." "I will see what I can do, Alicia," I said softly and ended the call. She had just handed me the perfect stage. Alicia lived for the approval of her wealthy suburban neighbors. Her entire existence was carefully curated to project the image of old money and flawless domestic bliss. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the local country club wives to prove her dominance over the family outcast. She was about to learn that you should never invite a predator into a glass house. I dialed Marcus, who was already walking back into the observation room with a satisfied smirk on his face. Did you happen to retain the due diligence file Vanguard Apex compiled on Preston's finances before they rejected his pitch? I asked. Marcus chuckled and patted his briefcase. I have every bank statement, defaulted loan, and final warning notice. The man has tried to hide for the last 3 years, Marcus said. The man is drowning in secret debt. Excellent, I said, standing up and smoothing the skirt of my crimson suit. Put all of it in a nice leather briefcase. We have a delivery to make. I contacted my head of private security and gave him a very specific set of instructions. I told him to retrieve the old beat-up Honda from the parking garage of my penthouse building. I did not want it washed. I did not want it detailed. I wanted it looking exactly as pathetic as it had the night Julian forced me into it. By 2:30 that afternoon, the Oak Ridge Estates block party was in full swing. Through the live feed of the discreet dash camera installed in the Honda, I watched the scene unfold from the comfort of my downtown office. Alicia's pristine cul-de-sac was lined with luxury SUVs and imported sports cars. Women in designer sundresses held crystal wine glasses while their husbands stood around expensive outdoor grills discussing golf handicaps and stock options. Alicia was holding court at the center of her manicured driveway, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and laughing loudly for the benefit of her audience. At exactly 2:45, the deafening squeal of failing brake pads shattered the quiet suburban atmosphere. My security chief, dressed in a sharp black suit and dark sunglasses, drove the rusted, sputtering Honda straight up Alicia's perfectly paved driveway. The car idled loudly, coughing a puff of gray exhaust smoke into the pristine air. The entire block party ground to a halt. The country club wives lowered their wine glasses, staring in shock at the eyesore polluting their aesthetic. Alicia's face turned a violent shade of red as she marched toward the vehicle, her heels stomping against the pavement. She was clearly expecting to find me cowering behind the steering wheel, ready to deliver my public apology. Instead, my security chief stepped out, towering over her with an intimidating presence. He did not say a single word. He simply dropped the rattling keys onto the hood of the car, gave her a brisk nod, and walked down the driveway toward a sleek black Escalade that had pulled up to the curb to collect him. "Hey," Alicia shouted, waving her arms frantically as the neighbors began to whisper among themselves. "Where is Gabrielle? She is supposed to apologize to me. Get back here." The security chief ignored her, completely sliding into the Escalade and driving away. Alicia stood alone next to the sputtering junk car, her face burning with humiliation as the whispers grew louder. The president of the Homeowners Association, a notoriously judgmental woman named Evelyn, stepped forward, crossing her arms. "Is everything all right, Alicia?" Evelyn asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Why is there a derelict vehicle leaking oil onto your driveway?" Alicia let out a frantic, nervous laugh, trying to save face. "It is just my pathetic sister-in-law," she stammered loudly, gesturing to the car. "She is practically destitute and trying to return a vehicle my generous brother bought her. She probably left a desperate apology letter inside. I am sure she is begging us for financial help." Wanting to prove her absolute superiority, Alicia reached through the open window and grabbed the heavy leather briefcase sitting on the driver's seat. She slammed it down onto the hood of the Honda and snapped the brass latches open right in front of Evelyn and half a dozen nosy neighbors. She flung the lid back, expecting to find a tear-stained letter of surrender. Instead, the afternoon wind caught the top layer of documents, blowing them directly into Evelyn's chest. Evelyn caught the thick parchment paper and adjusted her reading glasses. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she read the bold red lettering at the top of the page. "Notice of immediate foreclosure," Evelyn read aloud, her voice carrying across the silent driveway. "Final demand for payment regarding defaulted business loans, totaling $4 million issued to Preston Blackwell." Alicia froze, the blood completely draining from her face. She looked down into the open briefcase. It was packed to the brim with final notices, collection agency warnings, and frozen asset declarations. Her husband was not a wealthy venture capitalist. He was a fraud drowning in millions of dollars of hidden debt, and now the entire neighborhood knew it. The shockwave of Alicia's public humiliation rippled through the family with lightning speed, but nobody felt the impact harder than Julian. Preston's financial collapse meant the $1 million Julian had stolen from our home equity was gone forever, swallowed whole by his brother-in-law's mountain of defaulted loans. Julian was now standing on the edge of a massive legal cliff. The bank would soon come looking for their monthly payments on that fraudulent second mortgage, and when they realized the signature was forged, Julian would not just face disbarment, he would face federal prison. His desperate need for cash became a matter of pure survival. Julian had exactly one lifeline left. He was up for a partnership review at his prestigious downtown law firm, Harrison & Vance. Earning a partner title came with a massive signing bonus and a substantial profit share. It was the only way he could legally generate enough liquid cash to cover his tracks and pay off the fraudulent mortgage before the bank audited the loan. He poured every ounce of his remaining energy into the firm, working 100-hour weeks, sleeping on the small leather sofa in his office, and acting like the perfect, obedient corporate soldier. He truly believed his salvation was just days away. While Julian was busy fetching coffee for senior partners and polishing his expensive shoes, I was sitting in the private dining room of my penthouse hosting a very different kind of meeting. Marcus sat across from me alongside a team of 3 elite wealth managers from Switzerland. Spread across the long dining table were blueprints, financial disclosures, and commercial real estate portfolios. I had instructed my team to look into the corporate footprint of Harrison & Vance. I wanted to know exactly who owned the ground my husband walked on every single day. It did not take long to find the weak point. Harrison & Vance occupied the top 3 floors of a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. They did not own the office space, they leased it from a commercial real estate holding company known as Apex Property Group. And as luck would have it, their 10-year corporate lease was set to expire at the end of the month. They were currently in the final stages of negotiating a standard renewal rate. "Buy the building," I said, tracing the edge of my coffee cup with my index finger. "Buy the entire holding company. I do not care what premium they ask for. Use the offshore trust to make an all-cash offer they cannot possibly refuse and expedite the closing to 48 hours. My lead wealth manager, a sharply dressed woman named Vivian, looked at the financial projections and smiled. "Consider it done, Madam Chairman," she said, typing rapidly on her encrypted tablet. "And what are your directives regarding the law firm's lease renewal? When the acquisition is finalized, you will immediately reject their current renewal terms." I instructed, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of mercy. "You will issue a new lease agreement reflecting a 300% increase in their monthly rent. They either sign the new terms by Friday morning or they vacate the premises by Monday." Marcus let out a low whistle of appreciation. "A 300% increase will completely obliterate their quarterly profit margins." "Gabrielle," he said, adjusting his glasses, "a firm like Harrison & Vance runs on strict overhead budgets. If you triple their rent overnight, the senior partners will hemorrhage cash. They will have to execute mass layoffs just to keep the lights on." I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the city skyline. "I know," I said softly. By Friday morning, the atmosphere inside the polished glass walls of Harrison & Vance was absolute chaos. I monitored the fallout through the discreet updates Vivian sent to my phone. Julian, of course, was completely oblivious to the impending doom. He strutted into the firm that morning, wearing his best charcoal gray suit, his hair perfectly styled. He was practically vibrating with arrogance, believing that today was the day he would be called into the senior partner's office and handed his golden ticket to wealth and security. Instead, at exactly 10 o'clock, an emergency firm-wide meeting was called. Every associate paralegal and junior partner was ordered to drop whatever they were doing and assemble in the main boardroom. Julian took a seat near the front of the massive oak table, crossing his legs and trying to look incredibly important. He glanced around at his nervous colleagues with a smug expression, likely assuming that this meeting was a mere formality to announce his promotion. He adjusted his tie and waited for his moment of glory. The managing partner, Richard Harrison, walked into the boardroom looking like he had aged 10 years overnight. His face was pale, his tie was loosened, and he carried a stack of manila folders that hit the table with a heavy, depressing thud. The room fell dead silent as he gripped the edges of the podium. "I will not sugarcoat this," Harrison began, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. As of 8 o'clock last night, the management company that owns this building was acquired in a hostile cash takeover. We do not know who the new primary investor is, because they are hiding behind a maze of offshore corporate veils. But their first act as our new landlord was to reject our lease renewal and triple our rent effective immediately. A shocked gasp rippled through the boardroom. Lawyers exchanged panicked glances, but Julian just sat there blinking in confusion. He was still waiting for the part where he got rich. "This new landlord is completely ruthless," Harrison continued, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "We attempted to negotiate, but they refused to take our calls. To keep this firm from going bankrupt, and to cover this astronomical new overhead, we are forced to take extreme and immediate measures. There will be no new partners named this year. In fact, we are executing a mandatory 20% reduction in force starting right now." Julian's smug smile vanished. The color drained from his face as the words sank in. No new partners, no massive signing bonus, no lifeline to save him from the fraudulent mortgage. He shifted in his seat, his chest tightening with a sudden wave of absolute panic. "If your name is on the list," Harrison said grimly, looking out at the terrified faces of his staff, "you will receive an email from Human Resources in the next 30 seconds. You are to pack your desks and leave the building immediately." The boardroom was dead silent. Everyone stared down at their phones, holding their breath. Julian swallowed hard, staring at his own screen and praying for silence. He told himself he was too valuable. He was too important. He was a top-tier legal mind who belonged in this room. His phone buzzed violently against the mahogany table. Julian froze. His hands began to shake as he picked up the device and opened his inbox. There it was. An email from Human Resources with the subject line, "Notice of Immediate Termination." He read the cold robotic text informing him that his position had been eliminated due to extreme corporate restructuring. His access card was already deactivated. His health insurance would end at midnight. But it was the attachment at the bottom of the email that made his heart stop completely. It was a forwarded copy of the new lease agreement, the document that had destroyed the firm's budget and forced his termination. Julian opened the attachment, his eyes frantically scanning the harsh legal terms of the 300% rent increase. He scrolled down to the final page to see who had authorized this financial slaughter. At the bottom of the lease, right above the line for the holding company's ownership signature, was a name printed in crisp, bold black letters. Gabrielle Wilson, Chief Executive Officer. The news of Julian being terminated spread through the Chicago legal community faster than a wildfire. He had been escorted out of the Harrison and Vance building by security, carrying nothing but a cardboard box of his belongings. Preston was in hiding, dodging calls from aggressive creditors. The Wilson family was bleeding out financially and socially, but my mother-in-law Beatrice was not the type of woman to quietly accept defeat. When her back was against the wall, she doubled down on her delusions of grandeur. She firmly believed that a lavish display of wealth could overwrite any public scandal. 2 days after Julian lost his job, Beatrice orchestrated a desperate maneuver to save her family from total ruin. She booked the grand dining room at the historically Black Oakwood Heritage Club. Oakwood was a legendary institution in the city, an exclusive sanctuary for affluent professionals, politicians, and generational wealth. Membership was strictly invite-only, and Beatrice treated her status there like a royal title. She had organized a formal plated luncheon inviting the 50 wealthiest members of the club under the guise of a philanthropic gathering. In reality, it was a thinly veiled rescue mission. She was using the event to find new private investors for Preston, hoping to secure enough capital to quietly pay off his massive debts and cover the fraudulent mortgage Julian had signed. I sat in the plush leather seat of my town car, scrolling through the live updates my wealth manager Vivian was sending me. Beatrice was already inside holding court. According to my sources inside the club, she was pouring expensive champagne and spinning a masterful web of lies to her captive audience. She was telling the esteemed guests that Preston and Julian had voluntarily walked away from their corporate positions to launch a groundbreaking independent venture. She was painting them as visionary martyrs while simultaneously playing the role of the heartbroken grandmother. She repeated the same fabricated story that I was a mentally unstable runaway who had abandoned my twins, forcing her sons to sacrifice their careers to step up and protect the family. She was literally passing around a glossy prospectus, asking these influential people to write six-figure checks to save her criminal son-in-law. My car pulled up to the grand stone entrance of the Oakwood Heritage Club. I stepped out wearing a tailored emerald green sheath dress that contrasted perfectly with the crisp afternoon air. I was not there as a guest. I was there by the personal invitation of Arthur Caldwell, the president of the Oakwood Heritage Club. Arthur was a retired circuit court judge and a man of unimpeachable integrity. He had spent the last 2 years trying to secure funding to build a state-of-the-art community youth center on the South Side. The project had stalled due to massive budget shortfalls. That morning, I had authorized my trust to wire a $5 million donation to the Oakwood Foundation, fully funding the youth center in a single stroke. Arthur greeted me at the double mahogany doors with a warm, respectful smile. He offered me his arm and we walked down the carpeted hallway toward the grand dining room. The heavy brass-handled doors swung open just as Beatrice was standing at the head of the long banquet table, raising her crystal glass for a toast. She was wearing a flawless pearl-white suit, her face arranged in an expression of practiced, elegant sorrow. She was in the middle of asking the attendees to open their hearts and their checkbooks when Arthur walked straight to the podium at the front of the room. He gently tapped the microphone, silencing the murmurs of the wealthy crowd. Beatrice looked slightly annoyed by the interruption, but she quickly stepped aside, flashing Arthur a radiant, deferential smile. She clearly assumed the club president had come to publicly endorse her family in front of the gathered elite. Arthur began speaking, his deep voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He apologized for interrupting the luncheon, but stated he came bearing historic news. For the past 2 years, the club had struggled to fund their community youth initiative. He proudly announced that their financial hurdle had been overcome because a single anonymous donor had just fully funded the entire project with a $5 million endowment. The dining room erupted into genuine applause. The wealthy guests set down their silver forks and clapped enthusiastically. Beatrice clapped the loudest, her face beaming with absolute delight, clearly thrilled to be associated with such a momentous announcement during her luncheon. Arthur raised a hand to quiet the room, explaining that their benefactor had asked to remain largely private. However, he noted she had graciously agreed to join them this afternoon so he could personally thank her for her unparalleled generosity to their community. He then asked the room to welcome Madam Chairman Gabrielle Wilson. I stepped out from the shadows of the arched doorway and walked into the bright light of the dining room. The applause continued for a few seconds before a ripple of profound confusion swept through the tables. The guests who had just spent the last hour listening to Beatrice describe me as a penniless, deranged runaway were now staring at a polished, powerful woman being introduced as a multi-million-dollar philanthropist. Beatrice froze completely solid. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered violently against the hardwood floor. The sharp crash echoed through the sudden dead silence of the room. Her face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray as she stared at me. Her jaw opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked wildly at Arthur, then back at me, her mind completely fracturing as her reality collapsed in front of an audience of her peers. She finally found her voice shrieking in a hysterical pitch that violated every rule of country club decorum. She demanded to know what I was doing there. She screamed that I was a fraud and a thief. She turned to Arthur and frantically told him he had been conned, claiming I was trash who abandoned my children and did not even have a job, let alone $5 million. Beatrice then turned to the uniformed waitstaff standing near the walls, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face and screamed for security. She ordered the staff to remove me from her luncheon and throw me out on the street. She demanded that everyone remember who she was and respect her authority. The waitstaff did not move a single muscle. The 50 affluent guests sat completely paralyzed in their chairs, watching the matriarch of the Wilson family unravel into a screaming, frantic mess. I stood perfectly still, maintaining my calm, serene smile as I watched her destroy her own social standing in real time without me having to lift a finger. Arthur Caldwell stepped directly in front of me, shielding me from Beatrice and her erratic waving. His face was set in a mask of absolute judicial fury. He commanded her to stop, his voice slicing through her hysterics like a steel blade. He told her she would not speak to their guest of honor in that manner, and she would certainly not issue orders to his staff. He publicly admonished her for spending the last hour soliciting fraudulent investments from his members to cover her family's hidden debts. He announced to the silent room that the board was fully aware of the public spectacles her children had caused this week, including the fraudulent live stream fundraisers and the defaulted loans. Beatrice stumbled backward, bumping into the banquet table. She gripped the white linen tablecloth, her chest heaving as she looked around at the faces of her peers. The women who had been nodding in sympathy just moments ago were now looking at her with absolute disgust and pity. Arthur delivered the final devastating blow. He told Beatrice her behavior was a disgrace to the legacy of the institution. He declared that I was not leaving because I had just secured the future of their foundation. He then looked Beatrice dead in the eye and told her she was no longer welcome there. The board had voted unanimously that morning to revoke her membership to the Oakwood Heritage Club effective immediately. Beatrice let out a low, agonizing gasp, as if all the air had been violently punched from her lungs. She looked at the shattered glass at her feet and then up at my calm, unwavering gaze. She finally understood that I had not just taken her money, I had taken her kingdom. 2 security guards stepped into the dining room, flanking her on either side and silently gesturing toward the exit. The grand matriarch of the Wilson family lowered her head and walked out of the room in total, complete disgrace. The news of Beatrice being expelled from the Oakwood Heritage Club spread through the city faster than Julian losing his prestigious job. The Wilson family reputation was completely in ashes. I spent the weekend enjoying the absolute silence that came with total victory, holding my girls tight and knowing they were safe. Monday morning brought a crisp, biting chill to the Chicago air. I left my penthouse and instructed my driver to wait down the street while I walked to my favorite corner coffee shop in the Gold Coast district. I wore a tailored camel trench coat over a simple black dress, feeling more grounded and secure than I had in years. My personal security detail trailed a discreet distance behind me, ensuring I was protected without drawing unnecessary attention. I ordered an oat milk latte and stood near the large glass windows watching the morning commuters rush past. It was a beautiful, calm morning, and for the first time I felt entirely in control of my own destiny. I stepped out of the warm coffee shop feeling the paper cup warming my hands against the freezing wind. Before I could even turn toward my waiting car, a shadow stepped directly into my path, blocking the sidewalk. It was Julian. He looked absolutely dreadful. The man who had always prided himself on flawless designer suits and perfectly groomed hair now looked like a cornered, desperate animal. His expensive wool coat was wrinkled and stained, and his collar was unbuttoned. There were dark, heavy bags under his bloodshot eyes, and a rough shadow of stubble covered his jaw. He smelled of stale alcohol and sheer, unfiltered desperation. He had clearly spent the entire weekend spiraling after being escorted out of his law firm by security. "Gabrielle," he said, his voice a strained, raspy whisper, "we need to talk right now." I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking at him with mild, detached amusement. "I have absolutely nothing to say to you, Julian," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "Move out of my way before my security team moves you themselves." He stepped closer, glancing nervously at the pedestrians walking past us on the busy sidewalk. He forced a pathetic, rigid smile onto his face, trying desperately to resurrect the charming, manipulative persona he had used to control me for years. It was a truly pathetic sight to witness the man who had tormented me reduced to such a fragile state. You are making a huge mistake, he said, trying to sound authoritative and calm. You think you have won because you got some lucky payout and ran away, but you are playing a dangerous game. My mother is a total wreck and hiding in her house. Preston is facing bankruptcy and public humiliation. My firm let me go because of some insane corporate restructuring that makes absolutely no sense. The family is under a huge amount of stress right now. But I am willing to be the bigger person, Gabrielle. I am willing to forgive you for abandoning your duties to this family. I stared at him, letting his ridiculous words hang in the freezing air. He actually thought he still had the upper hand. He still believed I was the weak, isolated woman he had locked in a basement to code while he spent my money on his extravagant lifestyle. It was baffling how deeply his delusions ran. You are willing to forgive me, I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Yes, he nodded eagerly, leaning in closer and lowering his voice. I know the pressures of motherhood got to your head. I know you had a mental break because you could not handle the stress. But we can fix this together. I am an incredible lawyer, Gabrielle. I can protect you from the fallout of all this. All you have to do is come home right now. We can put this all behind us today. Just sign over the rights to that little accessibility app you have been working on. I can take over the management of it and sell it for parts and use the cash to stabilize the family finances. Once you sign the intellectual property over to me, I will personally ensure no one ever talks about your little psychotic episode again. He was completely oblivious to the truth. Even after Vanguard Apex rejected Preston and explicitly named my app, he still had not connected the dots. His ego was so massive, it completely blinded him to the reality that my little app was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He literally thought he was offering me a lifeline by demanding I surrender my life's work to pay for his massive fraud. He wanted to steal the very company that had just fired him. I let out a slow, soft laugh. It was a sound of pure, genuine pity. Julian heard the dismissal in my voice, and his fake smile instantly hardened into a vicious glare. His mask slipped completely, revealing the arrogant bully I had endured for far too long. He could not stand being laughed at by the woman he considered beneath him. Do not laugh at me, he hissed, stepping aggressively into my personal space. This is not a negotiation, Gabrielle. You took my children. You sneaked out in the middle of the night and kidnapped my heirs. If you do not sign those ownership papers right now, I will walk straight to the police precinct. I will file kidnapping charges today. I will tell the authorities that my unstable wife stole my babies and is holding them hostage. You will go to jail, and I will get full custody of Amari and Arya. You will never see them again. I did not flinch. I did not step back or show a single ounce of fear. I simply held his furious gaze while reaching my free hand into my oversized leather tote bag. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and pressed it flat against his chest. Julian instinctively grabbed it, looking down at the unmarked paper with deep confusion. Open it, I instructed, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. Julian ripped the top of the envelope open and pulled out a stack of crisp, glossy photographs. He stared at the top image, and all the color drained from his face in an instant. His hands began to shake violently, making the glossy paper rattle in the quiet morning air. The photograph was a high-definition, still image pulled directly from the security cameras at our local bank branch. It showed Julian sitting at the loan officer's desk, carefully forging my signature onto the second mortgage application. The bright red bank timestamp was printed clearly across the bottom corner of the image, perfectly documenting his crime. The next photo showed him handing his fake identification to the notary. The evidence was absolute and completely undeniable. I leaned in close so only he could hear my words over the noise of the city street. Federal fraud carries a 30-year sentence, Julian. Julian stood frozen on the frozen Chicago sidewalk, staring down at the glossy photographs in his trembling hands. The sheer arrogance that had defined his entire existence evaporated in a single breath. His mouth opened and closed, but the vicious threats he had been screaming just seconds ago were completely gone. He was looking at the undeniable proof of his own destruction. I did not wait for him to find his voice. I simply turned around and walked toward my waiting town car, leaving my husband gasping for air on the pavement, like a fish thrown onto dry land. I settled into the leather seat of my car and directed my driver to take me back to my penthouse. When I arrived, Marcus was already waiting in my home office, with his laptop open and a pair of noise-canceling headphones resting around his neck. When I had instructed my security team to drop off that leather briefcase full of Preston's defaulted loan notices at Alicia's block party, I had also asked them to make a small, highly illegal addition. Sewn directly into the interior lining of the briefcase was a microscopic audio transmitter. It was currently broadcasting a crystal-clear live feed directly from the center of Alicia's luxurious suburban living room. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and pressed a button on my desk, activating the room's speakers. The audio feed was absolute pristine chaos. Julian had apparently rushed straight from the coffee shop to his sister's house because his frantic, breathless voice echoed through my office. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, his words vibrating with raw terror. He told Preston and Alicia about the high-resolution photographs. He described the bank timestamps and the crystal-clear image of his pen forging my signature on the mortgage documents. He was hysterical, screaming that I was going to hand the file over to the federal authorities and that he would not survive a 30-year prison sentence. "I need the money back right now," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Preston, you have to wire that $1 million back into my account today. I have to pay off the bank and cancel the fraudulent loan before Gabrielle goes to the police. Call your father. Call your investment board. I do not care what you have to do, but I need that cash right this second." Through the speakers, I heard the heavy sound of a glass shattering against a wall. Alicia was crying, her voice a high-pitched wail of suburban despair. She demanded that Preston pick up his phone and call his wealthy Boston family. She screamed that they were facing absolute ruin. The block party humiliation had destroyed her social standing, the country club had exiled them, and now her brother was facing federal prison. She begged Preston to use his massive trust fund to bail them out of this nightmare. The silence that followed on the audio feed was heavy and suffocating. When Preston finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of its usual arrogant swagger. It sounded small, hollow, and entirely defeated. "I cannot call my father." Preston said, his words barely more than a mumble. "Call him right now," Julian roared, slapping his hand against a table. "You are a Blackwell. You come from generational wealth. Stop acting like a coward and ask your father for a bridge loan." "There is no generational wealth." Preston suddenly snapped, his voice rising in defensive anger. "My parents cut me off 5 years ago. They legally removed me from the family trust after I bankrupted my first startup company. I have not spoken to my father in 3 years. He thinks I am a complete financial failure. There is no safety net, Julian. There is no Boston money. I am completely broke." The silence that fell over the room was so absolute, I could hear the faint sound of Alicia hyperventilating. Julian's breathing grew shallow and ragged. "If you do not have any money," Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a horrifying realization. "If your family cut you off years ago, then how have you been paying for this house? How did you buy Alicia that diamond tennis bracelet last month? How are you paying for the luxury cars and the country club fees?" Preston let out a pathetic, nervous sigh. He admitted the truth with the casual cowardice of a man who had been running from reality for years. "I used the seed capital," Preston mumbled. "The money you transferred to me for our new venture capital firm. I needed to show the neighborhood that we were still successful. I had to pay off my aggressive creditors so they would not repossess the cars in front of the neighbors. Alicia needed to maintain her lifestyle to keep up appearances. The $1 million is gone, Julian. I spent it all." Julian let out a primal, agonizing scream. The sound of a violent physical scuffle erupted through the audio feed. Furniture crashed to the floor. Alicia shrieked at the top of her lungs, begging her brother to stop strangling her husband. Julian had committed a federal crime and destroyed his entire legal career just to fund his sister's vanity shopping habits and his brother-in-law's fake rich guy persona. The money he thought was securing his future as a powerful partner had been squandered on designer handbags and leased Mercedes SUVs. The realization that he had sacrificed his freedom for a suburban illusion completely broke his mind. I reached out and tapped the keyboard, muting the audio feed. The symphony of their destruction was incredibly satisfying, but I had heard enough. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. My empire was growing stronger by the minute, while their entire world was collapsing into dust. My personal cell phone buzzed softly against the glass surface of my desk. I picked it up and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Alicia. The woman who had spent years mocking my clothes, insulting my intelligence, and trying to orchestrate my removal from the family, was suddenly reaching out. I unlocked the screen and read the desperate paragraph she had just typed from the floor of her ruined home. Gabrielle, I know we have had our misunderstandings in the past, but at the end of the day, we are family. Family has to stick together during hard times. Julian and Preston are fighting and things are really bad right now. We are facing some temporary cash flow issues, and I know you just came into a massive amount of money. I am willing to offer a sisterly truce. Please call me back. We really need a loan to save the house. I love you, Gabrielle. Please help us. I stared at the glowing screen, reading her pathetic, manipulative words. She was completely cornered, stripped of her wealth and her dignity, and she was begging the woman she had tormented for a lifeline. She thought she could simply erase years of psychological abuse by offering a fake olive branch and asking for a handout. I did not type a reply. I did not block her number or send a sarcastic response. I simply left the message unread, allowing her to see that I had witnessed her desperation and chosen to do absolutely nothing. I placed the phone back on the desk and walked into my kitchen to pour a fresh cup of coffee, feeling lighter than air. Julian's panic had infected the entire Wilson family like a terminal disease. With Preston officially out of money and Alicia drowning in the harsh reality of her own suburban poverty, Julian turned his desperate sights on his mother. Beatrice was already nursing the deep psychological wound of being permanently expelled from the Oakwood Heritage Club, but she could not ignore the frantic late-night pleas of her golden child. Julian drove to her house in a state of absolute hysteria. He paced across her living room floor, detailing the high-resolution photographs, the bank timestamps, the forged signature, and the impending federal fraud charges. He begged his mother for the cash to pay off the bank before the authorities issued a warrant for his arrest and dragged him away in handcuffs. Beatrice smoothed her silk robe and assured him she had the perfect solution. Over the past few weeks, she had aggressively solicited the congregation of their affluent megachurch, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars under a fake charity she dubbed the Gabrielle Mental Health Fund. She promised Julian she would simply withdraw those unrecorded donations and transfer the cash directly into his personal account to save him from federal prison. What Beatrice did not realize was that I had been monitoring her philanthropic scam from the very moment she stepped up to the pulpit. While she was passing the collection plate and weeping fake tears for the congregation, my wealth manager Vivienne and my team of elite corporate attorneys had been meticulously tracking every single transaction. They traced the online transfers, documented the GoFundMe withdrawals, and matched them against the church's publicly filed tax records. They built a massive, undeniable paper trail of her deception. Once the dossier was complete, my legal team executed a flawless surgical strike. They bypassed local authorities entirely and filed a comprehensive whistleblower report directly with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. They also sent a certified thick copy of the IRS filing straight to the church's board of directors, outlining exactly how Beatrice was using their tax-exempt religious institution to run an illegal, unrecorded money laundering operation. The senior pastor and the financial board received the legal dossier on a Thursday afternoon, and absolute panic instantly consumed the church leadership. The board members understood immediately that Beatrice had put their entire institution at risk. Facing the catastrophic threat of losing their tax-exempt status and being dragged into a highly publicized federal investigation, The board took immediate and ruthless action to protect themselves. Without notifying Beatrice, they convened an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to instantly freeze every single discretionary account she managed. They locked her out of the banking portals, revoked her signatory rights, and seized total control of the fraudulent mental health fund. Beatrice was completely unaware of the invisible trap closing around her. On Friday morning, she marched into her local bank branch wearing a wide-brimmed hat and dark designer sunglasses, fully intending to execute a massive wire transfer to Julian. She walked up to the premier client desk and ordered the teller to move the funds. When the young woman nervously informed her that her access had been revoked and the church accounts were frozen, Beatrice threw a spectacular tantrum right in the middle of the polished lobby. She demanded to speak to the branch manager, screaming that it was a technical error and threatening to have the entire staff fired for incompetence. The bank manager simply walked out of his office and handed her a printed notice from the church board stating that her financial privileges had been permanently suspended, pending an internal audit. Beatrice snatched the paper and stormed out into the parking lot, her mind racing to formulate a new lie to tell her desperate son. By Sunday morning, Beatrice decided that her best defense was absolute brazen confidence. She firmly believed that if she just walked into the church and behaved like the untouchable, righteous matriarch she had always been, no one would dare question her authority. She dressed in her finest royal blue suit, pinned a sparkling diamond brooch to her lapel, and marched into the massive sanctuary for the early morning choir practice. The morning sun poured through the towering stained glass windows, illuminating the grand altar. Beatrice took her usual place, front and center, expecting the other women to fawn over her outfit and compliment her singing as they always did. Instead, the atmosphere in the cavernous room was thick with an unnatural, suffocating tension. The other choir members exchanged nervous whispers and deliberately avoided making eye contact with her. Beatrice ignored their strange behavior, raising her chin and singing louder than anyone else, trying to project an aura of total invincibility to mask her growing panic. She was halfway through a joyous hymn when the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open with a loud thud. Two men wearing dark, unassuming suits and carrying leather briefcases walked slowly and deliberately down the long center aisle. They did not stop at the empty pews. They walked straight up to the altar, interrupting the music director and stepping directly in front of Beatrice. The singing abruptly stopped. The piano music faded into a heavy, dead silence that echoed through the massive church. One of the men pulled a thick, folded document from his briefcase and handed it directly to my mother-in-law. He identified himself as an agent with the Internal Revenue Service and stated clearly that she was being formally served with a federal subpoena for financial records regarding her unrecorded fundraising activities. Beatrice stared at the document in her trembling hands, her royal blue suit suddenly looking entirely out of place in the harsh reality of the moment. The color drained from her face as she looked at the federal seal on the paper. Before she could muster a single word of defense or spin a new web of lies, the senior pastor and 3 members of the church board walked up to the altar, joining the federal agents. The pastor looked down at Beatrice, his face set in an expression of deep, righteous disappointment. He did not pull her aside to a back office for a quiet, private conversation to spare her feelings. He addressed her clearly and loudly, ensuring that his voice carried across the silent sanctuary to every single member of the choir. He announced that the board had uncovered massive financial irregularities linked directly to her unauthorized mental health fund. He stated that the church was cooperating fully with the federal audit and that she was officially stripped of all her duties and titles within their community. He then looked her dead in the eye and publicly accused her of embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from their congregation. Beatrice stood completely frozen on the altar, the federal subpoena shaking in her hands, finally trapped by her own inescapable greed. With Beatrice stripped of her power and the church's funds locked away under federal investigation, Julian's last remaining lifeline evaporated into thin air. He was completely out of options, out of money, and rapidly running out of time. Driven by a blind, cornered panic, he decided to make good on the vicious threat he had hissed at me outside the coffee shop. He truly believed he could still use the family court system as a weapon to force me into submission and extract the cash he needed to avoid federal prison. Julian filed an emergency ex parte motion for full immediate custody of our daughters Amari and Aria. In his sworn affidavit, he spun a fantastical and desperate narrative. He claimed I had suffered a severe psychological breakdown, abandoned our marital home, and was currently dragging our twins through homeless shelters and dangerous environments. He painted himself as the stable, responsible patriarch, desperately trying to rescue his children from a deranged runaway. He thought the legal system would automatically defer to his polished white-collar persona. He forgot he was no longer the golden boy of a prestigious downtown law firm. The following Tuesday morning, I walked into the Cook County Family Court building. The dreary, fluorescent-lit hallways were packed with anxious families and overworked public defenders. Julian was already pacing outside the heavy oak courtroom doors. Because Harrison and Vance had fired him and Preston's trust fund was a myth, Julian had been forced to scrape the absolute bottom of the legal barrel. He was standing next to a cheap, disheveled attorney wearing an ill-fitting, shiny gray suit. When Julian saw me walking down the corridor, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of dominance. He actually smirked, assuming I was terrified of losing my girls and ready to beg for his mercy. I did not look terrified. I looked like a queen arriving to inspect her domain. I was wearing a tailored, charcoal-structured blazer with a crisp ivory silk blouse, projecting effortless, absolute authority. Walking right beside me was Marcus, and one of the most feared and expensive family law litigators in the state of Illinois. Julian's smug expression faltered slightly when he saw the caliber of my legal counsel, but his toxic arrogance quickly overrode his common sense. We were called into the imposing courtroom of Judge Eris Thorne, a veteran magistrate widely known for her absolute intolerance of nonsense. We took our seats at the heavy wooden tables. Julian's bargain basement lawyer immediately launched into a loud, aggressive theatrical performance. He paced the floor, waving his hands and raising his voice, trying to intimidate me. He told the judge that I was an unemployed vagrant who had mysteriously vanished in the dead of night. He demanded to know where I was keeping the children, accusing me of subjecting them to unsafe, squalid living conditions because I had no discernible income. He aggressively demanded that the court grant Julian immediate physical custody to protect the girls from my supposed financial and mental instability. I sat perfectly still, letting his cheap lawyer burn through his oxygen and humiliate himself. Judge Thorne peered over her reading glasses, her expression completely unreadable, and asked my attorney for our response to these very serious allegations of housing instability and financial ruin. My lawyer did not shout or pace. He calmly stood up and produced 3 thick, leather-bound folders. He handed one to the court clerk to pass up to the judge and slid another across the aisle to Julian's attorney. I watched closely as Julian leaned over his lawyer's shoulder to look at the documents. It was my comprehensive financial disclosure alongside a certified copy of my residential deed. My lawyer politely informed the court that the children were not sleeping in a shelter. They were currently residing in a 10,000-square-foot high-security penthouse in the exclusive Gold Coast district, fully owned by me without a mortgage. He pointed out the attached documentation of their private tutors, their pediatric care schedule, and the 24-hour security detail I had hired to ensure their absolute safety. Judge Thorne flipped through the pages of the financial disclosure. The thick, heavy silence in the courtroom was broken only by the sound of crisp paper turning. Her eyes widened slightly as she scanned the bottom line of my verified net worth, seeing the 9-figure valuation of my technology company and the massive liquidity in my private accounts. She looked from the paper down to Julian's lawyer, who was now sweating profusely and frantically flipping through his own copy, utterly unable to comprehend the sheer scale of the wealth documented on the pages. He looked at Julian with an expression of pure betrayal, realizing his client had lied to him about everything. The judge then turned her sharp, penetrating gaze directly onto Julian. She picked up a separate file my attorney had submitted. It was a comprehensive, heavily documented breakdown of Julian's current reality. She noted for the official court record that the plaintiff, Julian Wilson, was currently unemployed, having been recently terminated from his firm for cause. But she did not stop there. Her voice turned to ice as she read aloud the documentation regarding a heavily flagged $1 million fraudulent second mortgage attached to his name, alongside notice of an impending federal bank investigation. She looked at Julian with utter absolute contempt. "You come into my courtroom demanding emergency custody on the grounds of financial instability," she said, her voice echoing like a whip crack against the mahogany walls. "Yet the documentation proves your wife is providing an extraordinarily stable and secure environment for these children while you are unemployed, drowning in massive, unaccounted debt, and facing severe legal jeopardy." Julian opened his mouth to protest, to spin another lie, to try and gaslight the judge, just as he had done to me for years. He raised a shaking hand, stammering that the documents were fake and that I was manipulating the court. Judge Thorne slammed her heavy wooden gavel down with a deafening crack, cutting him off instantly. She declared his motion entirely frivolous and dismissed it with prejudice on the spot. Furthermore, she looked down from her bench and ordered Julian to pay 100% of my exorbitant legal fees within 30 days, citing his malicious intent and his massive, unexplainable financial liabilities. The sound of Judge Thorne slamming her gavel echoed through the courtroom like a definitive death knell for Julian Wilson. He stood paralyzed at the defense table, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. The man who had spent our entire marriage lecturing me about financial responsibility had just been ordered to cover my astronomical legal fees while drowning in a sea of his own fraudulent debt. He stumbled out of the family court building looking like a ghost, his cheap gray suit hanging off his suddenly deflated frame. There was no aggressive swagger left, no condescending smirk. He was finally waking up to the reality that his pristine white-collar illusion had been entirely shattered. But delusion is a deeply rooted disease in the Wilson family, and they were not ready to surrender. With Julian facing federal bank fraud charges, Alicia dodging the foreclosure of her suburban mansion, and Beatrice completely disgraced and locked out of her megachurch, the family was trapped in a suffocating corner. Traditional banks had blacklisted them. Their wealthy country club friends had abandoned them the moment the rumors of their insolvency began to circulate. They needed a massive injection of untraceable cash to pay off their mounting legal bills and save their heavily mortgaged properties. They needed a miracle, and they believed they had found one in the upcoming Black Excellence Gala. The gala was the absolute pinnacle of the Chicago social season. It was an exclusive, highly publicized charity event that gathered the most powerful, affluent, and influential figures in the city under one roof. For years, the Wilsons had attended this event to flaunt their supposed generational wealth and look down upon anyone who did not meet their impossible standards. This year, however, they were not attending to socialize. They were attending on a desperate hunting mission. Word had rapidly spread through the financial district that a mysterious anonymous tech billionaire had stepped in as the title sponsor for the event. Rumors painted this elusive figure as an aggressive angel investor who was actively looking to fund new ventures and rescue distressed assets. Julian immediately convinced his mother and his sister that this was their golden ticket out of ruin. He sold them on a delusional fantasy where he would casually approach this billionaire at the VIP reception, pitch his brilliant legal mind, and secure a massive private bridge loan to quietly erase all their debts. To execute this pathetic scheme, they had to get into the room. But their invitation to the gala had been revoked weeks ago due to non-payment of their annual foundation dues. Driven by absolute desperation, the three of them pooled the very last remnants of their available credit. Alicia pawned her remaining authentic diamond jewelry. Julian took out a predatory, high-interest personal loan. Beatrice emptied a secret emergency account she had hidden from her husband. They scraped together exactly enough cash to purchase 3 premium VIP tickets on the secondary market at a massive markup. They were betting their absolute last dollar on a single night, believing that their family charm and practiced arrogance would save them from total destruction. While they were frantically trying to glue the shattered pieces of their fake empire back together, I was enjoying the serene quiet of my Gold Coast penthouse. I stood in the center of my expansive dressing room, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering Chicago skyline. The city was mine, and tonight I was going to formally introduce myself to it. The private elevator chimed softly, signaling the arrival of my personal styling team. A renowned Parisian designer stepped into the foyer, followed closely by two assistants carrying a massive garment bag. They unzipped the heavy black canvas to reveal the masterpiece I had commissioned specifically for this evening. It was a $50,000 custom couture gown crafted from deep sapphire silk. The fabric caught the light like liquid glass cascading into a dramatic sweeping train that commanded absolute authority. The bodice was structured and powerful, covered in thousands of hand-sewn midnight crystals that glittered with a dangerous quiet intensity. It was not just a dress, it was a suit of armor designed for a queen preparing to publicly execute her enemies. I slipped into the gown, the cool silk settling perfectly against my skin. My glam squad worked in absolute silence, pinning my hair into a sleek, elegant updo and applying a flawless, sharp makeup look that accentuated my features. I did not need heavy jewelry or loud accessories. The raw power radiating from my posture was more than enough. I looked in the full-length mirror and saw a woman completely unrecognizable from the timid, exhausted wife who used to quietly endure Beatrice's insults and Julian's psychological abuse. Marcus, my lead attorney and closest confidant, walked into the dressing room holding a sleek leather portfolio. He stopped in his tracks, letting out a low, impressed whistle as he took in the final look. He handed me the portfolio, which contained the master logistics file for the evening. As the anonymous title sponsor, I essentially owned the Black Excellence Gala. I controlled the catering, the press access, the lighting cues, and most importantly, the seating arrangements. I opened the leather folder and pulled out the oversized laminated seating chart for the grand ballroom. My event coordinator had executed my instructions with absolute flawless precision. I ran my manicured finger down the list of names until I found them: Julian Wilson, Beatrice Wilson, Alicia Preston. They had spent their last desperate dollars purchasing VIP tickets, expecting to be seated among the elite power brokers of the city where they could mingle and scheme. When they arrived, they would be thrilled to discover they had been given the best seats in the entire venue. I had personally placed them at table 1. It was located dead center in the ballroom, positioned directly at the foot of the main stage. There were no visual obstructions. There was nowhere to hide. They would have a crystal-clear front-row view for the keynote address. They thought their premium placement was a stroke of incredible luck, a sign that the universe was finally tilting back in their favor. They had absolutely no idea that I had arranged those seats, so they would be forced to look up and watch as the woman they had relentlessly tormented stepped out of the shadows to claim her empire. The evening air was crisp as a steady stream of luxury vehicles pulled up to the grand entrance of the museum. The Black Excellence Gala was a spectacle of absolute opulence and unbridled power. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sprawling red carpet, while dozens of photographers aggressively flashed their cameras at the arriving elite. Julian stepped out of a rented black sedan, attempting to project the aura of a high-powered attorney who still commanded respect in the financial district. He offered his hand to his mother Beatrice, who was wearing a severely outdated sequined gown she had clearly pulled from the back of her closet. She held her head artificially high, trying to mask the fact that she was currently under federal investigation and locked out of her own bank accounts. Alicia and Preston followed closely behind them, plastering on desperate, rigid smiles for the flashing cameras. They moved through the grand foyer like a pack of starving wolves, desperately scanning the room for the anonymous billionaire they believed would save them from total ruin. When the usher checked their tickets and directed them into the grand ballroom, their fragile egos swelled with arrogant validation. They were led directly to table 1, located at the very edge of the main stage with a flawless, unobstructed view of the podium. Julian adjusted his tightly tailored tuxedo jacket and whispered to his mother that their premium placement was undeniable proof the event organizers recognized his inherent status. Beatrice smoothed her vintage dress and smugly agreed, completely convinced that their family names still carried immense weight in the city. Alicia quickly began snapping photos of the stage on her phone, ready to post the images online to maintain her fake wealthy persona. Preston sat beside her nervously adjusting his collar. They sat in their prime seats, utterly oblivious to the fact that they were resting exactly where I wanted them. They actually believed they were perfectly positioned to ambush the elusive billionaire the moment the speeches concluded. Outside the museum, the chaotic clamor of the red carpet suddenly dropped into a hushed, reverent silence. A massive custom jet black Maybach glided smoothly to a halt directly in front of the velvet ropes. The driver quickly stepped out and opened the heavy rear door. I placed my silver stiletto onto the plush crimson carpet and stepped fully into the blinding array of flashing lights. The sapphire silk of my custom couture gown caught the relentless explosion of camera flashes, shimmering with a deep magnetic intensity. The thousands of hand-sewn midnight crystals embedded in the bodice glittered like a weaponized constellation. I did not rush. I walked up the grand staircase with the slow, deliberate pacing of a woman who entirely owned the ground she stood upon. The press immediately recognized the shift in power. Reporters pushed against the velvet ropes, shouting questions and begging for a glance while I offered them only a cool, composed smile. I moved through the ornate double doors and entered the grand foyer. The heavy silk train of my gown gliding silently across the polished marble floor. The sheer magnitude of my presence commanded immediate attention. Elite socialites and powerful executives naturally parted ways to let me pass, sensing an authority they could not quite identify, but instinctively respected. Conversations paused as guests turned to admire the breathtaking craftsmanship of the gown and the unyielding confidence in my stride. I was no longer the quiet, supportive wife who shrank into the background to let Julian shine. I was the main event. Julian was standing near the entrance of the grand ballroom, holding a glass of borrowed champagne and aggressively trying to strike up a conversation with a local bank executive. He was sweating slightly, laughing too loud, and leaning in too close, desperate to project an image of casual wealth. As the crowd subtly shifted to accommodate my entrance, his eyes landed directly on me. The smug, arrogant expression on his face instantly shattered completely, replaced by a pale, sickly look of absolute horror. He dropped his conversation mid-sentence and slammed his champagne glass onto a passing waiter's tray. He marched furiously across the marble floor directly toward me, his face flushed with panicked rage. He grabbed my elbow, trying to roughly pull me behind a large, towering floral arrangement to hide me from the wealthy guests. He leaned in close, his breath smelling sour and desperate. He hissed through clenched teeth, demanding to know what I was doing, crashing the most exclusive event of the year. He looked at my breathtaking sapphire gown and sneered, accusing me of completely losing my mind. He aggressively whispered that I must have maxed out dozens of stolen credit cards or taken out fraudulent loans just to rent a fake designer dress to play dress-up for one single night. He called me a pathetic homeless vagrant and ordered me to turn around and walk out the door immediately. He frantically claimed that my embarrassing presence was going to ruin his reputation and destroy his one chance to secure a massive investment from the billionaire sponsor. I looked down at his trembling hand gripping my arm and then looked up directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I simply offered him a cold, terrifying smile that made him instantly take a step back in sheer confusion. His insults bounced off me like rain against a stone fortress. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my bare arm, smoothing the silk fabric where he had dared to touch it. I let the silence hang between us, allowing his panic to fester. Before Julian could spit out another vicious insult or demand my removal, the heavy booming voice of the master of ceremonies echoed through the massive surround sound speakers, commanding the immediate attention of the entire venue. The elegant crowd fell totally silent and turned their faces toward the brightly lit stage. The master of ceremonies asked the distinguished guests to please part ways and direct their attention to the center aisle. He announced that it was his absolute honor to finally introduce the mysterious benefactor who had rescued the foundation and made the entire spectacular evening possible. The booming voice requested a massive standing ovation to welcome the title sponsor and the evening keynote speaker directly to the stage. He confidently and clearly called out my full name. The sound of my name echoing through the grand ballroom hit Julian with the physical force of a freight train. His hand fell away from my arm as if he had been burned. He stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The frantic rage that had consumed him just seconds ago evaporated entirely, replaced by a vacant, uncomprehending shock. I did not wait for him to process the reality of his situation. I turned my back on him, leaving him paralyzed near the entrance, and continued my deliberate walk down the center aisle. The crowd of Chicago elite erupted into thunderous applause. Billionaires, industry titans, and powerful politicians rose to their feet to honor the anonymous benefactor who had saved their prestigious foundation. I glided toward the brightly lit stage, the heavy sapphire silk of my custom gown flowing flawlessly behind me. I ascended the velvet-lined stairs with perfect poise, stepping up to the clear acrylic podium. I rested my hands on the edges of the stand and looked out over the sea of incredibly wealthy, influential faces. Slowly, I raised my hand, and the deafening applause began to fade, tapering off until the massive ballroom fell into a dead, expectant silence. I lowered my gaze directly to table 1, located just a few feet below me. Beatrice was staring up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were completely white against the crisp linen cloth. Her chest was heaving as she hyperventilated, the crushing weight of her impending federal indictment colliding violently with the realization that I was the billionaire sitting at the top of the food chain. Beside her, Alicia was trembling, her fake diamond jewelry suddenly looking as cheap as her character. Preston sat rigidly in his chair, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit, like a cornered animal realizing the trap had been sprung. "Good evening," I began, my voice ringing clear and resonant through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate excellence, to honor those who build empires from the ground up, and to recognize the profound strength it takes to overcome insurmountable adversity." A murmur of polite agreement rippled through the crowd. I kept my posture relaxed, my delivery smooth and captivating. I spoke about my own journey, detailing the countless nights I spent coding software in total isolation, pouring every ounce of my energy into a technology company that no one believed in. I spoke about the immense challenges of navigating a ruthless corporate landscape and fighting for a seat at the table. I held the entire room in the palm of my hand. The wealthy audience hung on my every word, completely mesmerized by the narrative of a self-made titan. But as we all know, true adversity does not always come from competitors or harsh market conditions. I continued, my tone shifting seamlessly from inspiring to dangerously clinical. Sometimes the greatest threats to our success are the parasites hiding in our own homes, sitting right at our own tables. The atmosphere in this room instantly grew cold. The polite smiles of the socialites faltered, replaced by a sudden, intense curiosity. I did not break eye contact with the Wilson family as I delivered my next words. "Excellence demands absolute integrity," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "It demands that we purge the frauds and the criminals from our circles, no matter who they are. For example, please direct your attention to the man currently standing frozen in the center aisle." Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously to look at Julian. He was still standing exactly where I had left him, shivering in his cheap rented tuxedo, completely exposed to the merciless judgment of the entire room. "That man is my soon-to-be former husband, Julian Wilson," I announced, my voice echoing with devastating clarity. "He is a man who spent years projecting an image of white-collar superiority while secretly drowning in a sea of his own incompetence." Recently, he decided to fund his reckless lifestyle by forging my signature on highly illegal mortgage documents, stealing millions of dollars, and committing federal bank fraud. He willingly threw away his entire legal career and his freedom just to maintain a pathetic illusion of wealth. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The Chicago elite began whispering frantically, pulling out their phones and staring at Julian with undisguised disgust. But I was not finished. I shifted my gaze down to Preston, who was now desperately trying to hide his face behind his hand. And why did he commit these federal crimes? I asked rhetorically, pausing for maximum impact. He stole those millions to fund the man sitting at table one. Preston Blackwell poses as a highly successful venture capitalist to all of you. He attends your country clubs and drinks your expensive wine. I am here to inform you that Preston Blackwell is entirely bankrupt. He was legally disinherited by his wealthy Boston family years ago for gross financial mismanagement. He has no trust fund. He has no capital. He used my stolen money to lease luxury cars and buy fake jewelry for his wife Alicia, just to convince this esteemed community that they belonged among you. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. The people seated at the adjacent tables visibly recoiled, pulling their chairs away from the Wilsons, as if their poverty and criminality were contagious diseases. The elite crowd murmured in outrage, insulted that these suburban frauds had dared to infiltrate their exclusive ranks. Beatrice let out a pathetic whimpering sound, burying her face in her hands as the final shreds of her social standing were incinerated on live broadcast. In the center aisle, Julian finally snapped. The public execution of his ego in front of the exact billionaires he had planned to solicit for money completely shattered his fragile mind. He let out a raw, animalistic roar of pure rage. He lowered his head and charged down the aisle, shoving a waiter out of the way and sprinting wildly toward the stage. His face was purple with fury, his hands reaching out to grab the microphone and silence me. He never even made it to the first step. My private security detail moved with terrifying invisible speed. Two massive men in tailored black suits stepped out from the shadows of the stage, intercepting Julian mid-stride. They hit him with flawless, brutal efficiency. One guard grabbed his extended arm, twisting it sharply behind his back, while the other swept his legs out from under him. Julian crashed down onto the polished marble floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as the former golden boy was forcefully pinned face down against the ground directly in front of table one. He thrashed and screamed, spitting out incoherent threats, while my guards knelt on his back, applying just enough pressure to keep him completely immobilized. I stood above him at the podium, my sapphire gown catching the light, looking down at his ruined existence with absolute icy indifference. I stood at the clear acrylic podium and looked down at the pathetic spectacle unfolding at my feet. Julian was pinned flat against the cold marble floor, his cheek pressed hard against the polished stone. His chest heaved with ragged, desperate breaths as my private security detail held him effortlessly in place. The massive grand ballroom was so incredibly silent that the only sound echoing through the cavernous space was the frantic scuffling of Julian's expensive leather shoes, desperately trying to find traction. The elite power brokers of Chicago, the billionaires and politicians who Julian had spent his entire life trying to impress, were watching him with expressions of absolute, unadulterated disgust. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or break my perfectly composed posture. I simply looked past his struggling form and gave a subtle, deliberate nod to the production booth located at the far end of the venue. The main ballroom lights dimmed slightly, casting a dramatic shadow over the crowd. An instant later, the massive high-definition projector screens flanking the main stage flared to life with a blinding white light. The wealthy guests murmured in confusion, expecting to see a promotional video for the foundation or a glittering montage of charity work. Instead, they were greeted by the stark, clinical black and white text of a certified legal document. The image was magnified to an impossible scale, ensuring that even the guests seated at the very back of the room could read every single devastating word. For those of you who appreciate transparency in business, I highly recommend reading the documents currently displayed on the screens. I announced, my voice gliding smoothly over the premium sound system. What you are looking at is the official certified notice of federal foreclosure for the Wilson family estate. Beatrice let out a strangled, horrific gasp. Her hands flew to her throat as she stared up at the towering screens. Their projected for the wealthiest people in the city to examine was the absolute destruction of her carefully curated social standing. I had the AV team highlight the most damning sections of the legal filing in bright crimson digital ink. The document meticulously detailed the catastrophic defaulted loans, the predatory secondary mortgages Julian had secretly taken out, and the staggering mountain of fraudulent debt that had finally crushed them. But I was not done. I directed the crowd's attention to the very bottom of the document, where a specific date and time had been circled in heavy red ink. You will notice the execution date stamped at the bottom. I continued, my tone completely conversational, as if I were discussing a minor scheduling adjustment. The primary lending bank, working in conjunction with federal authorities, will be executing the seizure of the Wilson property tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. Beatrice began to hyperventilate. Her chest shuddered violently as she gripped the edges of the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the crisp white linen. The reality of the situation crashed down upon her with suffocating force. In less than 12 hours, she was going to be physically locked out of the suburban mansion she had used to terrorize and belittle others for decades. She was going to be completely homeless, bankrupt, and entirely disgraced. She tried to hide her face behind her hands, weeping uncontrollably, but the flashing cameras of the press corps had already pivoted away from me and were now violently snapping photos of her total breakdown. I then signaled the AV team to switch to the second document. The screens flickered, and a new financial ledger appeared, this one mapping a complex web of wire transfers. I wanted to make sure every single rat in the nest was fully exposed to the light. You might be wondering where all those stolen millions went, I said, gesturing gracefully to the new schematic. Julian did not just forge documents to cover his own failing lifestyle. He illegally funneled millions of dollars into shell accounts operated by the man sitting right there at table 1. Preston Blackwell froze. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a panicked ghost. The digital ledger on the massive screens clearly showed his name connected to Julian's fraudulent bank accounts. The venture capital firm Preston had been loudly bragging about all evening was publicly exposed as a hollow, empty shell funded entirely by stolen money. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and brutal. The elite investors and hedge fund managers sitting at the adjacent tables visibly recoiled. They pulled their chairs away from Preston and Alicia, looking at them with a mixture of profound outrage and absolute contempt. The man they had been drinking champagne with just moments ago, the man who had been trying to solicit them for investments, was nothing more than a common thief living on borrowed time and stolen funds. Preston stared up at the screens, his mind racing as he connected the catastrophic dots. He realized in real time that Julian's incredibly sloppy criminal trail was going to drag him directly into a federal penitentiary. The polished, wealthy facade Preston had maintained for years slipped completely away, revealing the feral, terrified coward hiding underneath. He did not look at me. He looked down at Julian, who was currently being hauled up onto his knees by my security guards. The sheer panic in Preston's eyes rapidly mutated into a blind, violent rage. He realized that Julian had ruined him. Julian had promised the wire transfers were untraceable. Julian had sworn their pathetic illusion was secure. "You arrogant, stupid liability!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with unprecedented fury. Preston lunged forward violently, kicking his chair out of the way. He cleared the short distance between table 1 and the edge of the stage in a split second. He threw a wild, desperate punch that connected squarely with Julian's jaw with a sickening crack. The impact snapped Julian's head back, but the pain only ignited his own humiliation and suppressed rage. Julian broke free from the loosened grip of the security guards, letting out a furious scream as he tackled Preston around the waist. The two men crashed backward into table 1 with devastating force. Crystal champagne flutes shattered into 1,000 pieces, sending expensive vintage wine splashing across Alicia's ruined dress. The massive floral centerpiece toppled over, scattering white roses across the marble floor as the heavy wooden table collapsed under their combined weight. The two men rolled across the polished floor of the grand ballroom, trapped in a vicious, screaming fistfight. They punched and clawed at each other, tearing their cheap rented tuxedos and spitting blood onto the pristine marble. Preston screamed that Julian was a complete failure who had destroyed their lives, while Julian desperately punched back, sobbing that Preston was a useless parasite who had begged for the stolen cash. They were airing every single dirty secret, every ounce of their toxic family history, right there on the floor for the most powerful people in Chicago to witness. The elite crowd watched in stunned, morbid fascination as the former golden boy and the fake venture capitalist physically battered each other into total ruin. I stood perfectly still at the podium, looking down at the beautiful, absolute carnage they had brought upon themselves. I watched from the elevated stage as the two men rolled violently across the shattered crystal and crushed white roses. Julian threw a wild, desperate punch that connected heavily with Preston along the cheekbone, sending a spray of blood across the polished marble floor. The sickening sound of their fists hitting flesh echoed through the cavernous grand ballroom, completely silencing the ambient background music. This was not a sophisticated corporate dispute or a polite disagreement between gentlemen. This was a raw, ugly street brawl between two desperate frauds who had finally run out of lies and out of time. The billionaire investors, hedge fund managers, and powerful politicians who had once tolerated the Wilson family now backed away in sheer horror. They pulled their designer gowns and tailored suits out of the reach of the splashing blood and spilled vintage wine, looking down at the two men with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Alicia stood frozen at the edge of the wreckage, her eyes locked onto the massive projector screens glowing brightly above my head. The digital ledger displaying Preston and his empty shell accounts was a glaring, undeniable testament to the absolute truth of her pathetic existence. For years, she had paraded around Chicago social circles, bragging endlessly about her brilliant venture capitalist husband. She had looked down on anyone she deemed inferior, hiding behind a carefully constructed wall of arrogance. Now the entire room knew that her leased luxury cars, her rented exotic vacations, and her fake diamond jewelry were funded entirely by Julian and his federal bank fraud. A guttural scream of pure humiliation ripped from her throat. She did not try to stop the fight or pull the men apart. Instead, she lunged forward, grabbing her heavy beaded evening bag, and began viciously beating Preston on the head and shoulders as he wrestled with Julian on the floor. She shrieked that he was a worthless liar and a pathetic con artist who had ruined her life. She sobbed hysterically that she would be the laughingstock of the city, demanding a divorce right then and there over the sound of breaking glass and shouting security guards. Preston tried to shield his bleeding face from Alicia and her frantic blows while simultaneously fending off Julian and his relentless punches. Blinded by panic and rage, Preston shoved Alicia forcefully backward to protect himself. She stumbled wildly on her high heels and crashed backward into a neighboring dining table. She tumbled to the floor, her expensive silk dress tearing loudly along the seam as she landed in a sticky puddle of spilled champagne and broken plates. She sat there covered in wine and absolute humiliation, weeping uncontrollably as the surrounding elite socialites pointed their smartphones at her and recorded every second of her destruction. Her pristine, perfectly curated illusion was completely and permanently obliterated. I shifted my gaze slightly to the left, observing the matriarch of the family. Beatrice had not moved from her chair at the ruins of Table 1. Her eyes were completely glazed over, locked in a vacant, terrified stare at the official foreclosure notice, still projected in bright crimson ink on the massive screens behind me. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Those words were burned permanently into her retinas. The sprawling suburban mansion she had used as a fortress of judgment was gone. The grand home where she had hosted her exclusive church gatherings and looked down on her congregation with pious superiority had been seized. The bank was coming to physically throw her out onto the street in less than 12 hours. Her chest heaved violently as a severe panic attack seized her lungs. She slipped out of her chair and collapsed onto her hands and knees on the cold marble floor. Her outdated sequined gown bunched up awkwardly around her legs as she crawled blindly trying to find a dark corner to hide in. But there was nowhere to hide in the center of the brightly lit grand ballroom. The wealthy elite she had spent her entire life trying to impress were currently watching her pathetic mental breakdown with cold, indifferent eyes. She was no longer a respected elder of the community. She was a homeless, disgraced fraud gasping for air on the floor of a museum. Julian managed to briefly pin Preston to the ground, raising his bruised and bloody fist to deliver another devastating blow. But as he looked up, his eyes caught the massive glowing screens displaying his federal crimes and the foreclosure of his mother and her home. The sheer magnitude of his total failure finally pierced through his blinding adrenaline. His arm dropped limply to his side. He realized with crushing clarity that no amount of physical violence against Preston could change the fact that he was going to federal prison. He looked around the room, seeing the disgusted faces of the bank executives, the wealthy clients, and the powerful judges he had spent years trying to court. They were looking at him like he was a diseased, dangerous animal. I gave a subtle nod to my lead security director, signaling that it was time to end the physical spectacle. 4 massive guards in tailored black suits descended upon the wreckage. They grabbed Julian by the collar of his torn, ruined tuxedo and hauled him roughly to his feet. They did the same to Preston, who was bleeding heavily from a deep cut above his right eye. Both men were slammed face first against the nearest intact table, their arms violently wrenched behind their backs and secured. They were gasping for air, thoroughly beaten and utterly defeated by their own hands. I stepped slightly away from the clear acrylic podium, allowing the harsh glow of the projector screens to cast a long, commanding shadow across the stage. I looked down at the 4 of them. Julian was bleeding and pinned against the table. Preston was sobbing openly about his ruined reputation. Alicia was sitting in a puddle of wine tearing at her fake jewelry, and Beatrice was crawling on the floor in a state of total catatonic shock. Just as the final echo of my voice faded through the high-definition speakers, a new sound began to permeate the grand ballroom. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing through the quiet downtown streets. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and grew deafeningly loud. The piercing, shrill wail of multiple police sirens approached the museum, cutting through the quiet elegance of the Chicago night. Flashing red and blue lights began to reflect through the massive glass windows of the grand foyer, painting the pale marble walls with a frantic, urgent rhythm. Julian jerked his head up, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute primal terror. He realized instantly that the police were not coming to break up a simple fistfight. They were coming for him. The heavy brass handles of the main ballroom doors turned with a loud mechanical clack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent, cavernous space. The massive oak panels swung inward, revealing the flashing red and blue lights of the squad cars parked directly outside the grand foyer. A team of uniformed Chicago police officers stepped into the room, their heavy boots thudding against the polished marble floor. They were flanked by 2 grim-faced plainclothes federal detectives wearing dark trench coats and displaying silver badges clipped to their belts. The room remained perfectly dead silent, except for the sharp static crackle of police radios and the ragged breathing of the men pinned to the floor. The crowd of billionaires, politicians, and elite socialites immediately parted, clearing a wide path down the center aisle. They stepped back, pulling their expensive silk gowns and tailored suits tightly against their bodies, eager to distance themselves from the contagious stain of criminality. Julian turned his head weakly against the cold marble, his bloodshot eyes watching the officers approach. A pathetic flicker of relief briefly washed over his bruised face. In his delusional, arrogant mind, he likely believed they were simply there to break up the physical altercation. He probably thought he could use his legal background to talk his way out of a simple battery charge, perhaps even convince the officers that Preston had started the fight. He was entirely wrong. The lead detective bypassed the overturned tables, the shattered crystal, and the spilled vintage wine. He marched directly toward the edge of the stage, where my private security detail was holding Julian firmly in place. The detective did not look at Preston. He did not look at the ruined floral arrangements. He locked his eyes entirely on my soon-to-be former husband. Julian Wilson, the detective, stated, his voice ringing with absolute unforgiving authority. Julian swallowed hard, trying desperately to summon the polished, confident lawyer persona he had hidden behind for years. "Yes, officer," he stammered, a trickle of blood running down his chin. "This man attacked me. I want to press charges for assault." The detective did not even blink. He reached behind his back and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Julian Wilson, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The remaining shred of Julian's ego shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a panicked, sickly ghost. His knees buckled entirely as my security guards hauled him to his feet and handed him over to the federal agents. The harsh, mechanical ratcheting sound of the steel cuffs snapping tightly around his wrists echoed through the ballroom. It was the sound of his career, his freedom, and his entire life coming to a brutal, permanent end. He stared blankly at the detective, realizing with suffocating clarity that this arrest was not about the fistfight. The authorities had already seen the documents I just projected on the massive screens. They already knew everything. As Julian was being violently read his Miranda rights, the horrific reality of the situation finally registered in Alicia's mind. She was still sitting on the marble floor amidst a sticky puddle of spilled champagne and ruined white roses. Her cheap silk dress was torn along the seam and soaked in vintage wine. She stared at Preston, who was bleeding heavily from a deep cut above his eye and pinned against the debris of Table 1. The digital ledger glowing brightly on the massive screens above us suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense to her. Preston had no venture capital firm. He had no wealthy investors. He had no trust fund. "You are broke!" Alicia screamed, her voice tearing through the ballroom like a rusted saw. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, slipping in the spilled wine, entirely abandoning whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left. She grabbed Preston by the lapels of his torn tuxedo, shaking him violently as the surrounding socialites watched in sheer disgust. "You have nothing!" she shrieked, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "You told me we were rich. You bought me that car. You bought me this jewelry. You used stolen money. I married a venture capitalist, not a bankrupt federal criminal." Preston cringed, trying to pull away from her frantic blows. He looked around at the judgmental faces of the Chicago elite, begging Alicia to lower her voice, terrified of making an even bigger scene. But Alicia was completely unhinged. She beat her fists against his chest, her cheap jewelry rattling loudly. "I want a divorce!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysterical despair. "I want a divorce right now! I am not going to prison for you! You ruined my life!" While Alicia violently dismantled her marriage, Beatrice was experiencing a complete and utter psychological collapse. The matriarch of the Wilson family was still crawling on the floor, her outdated sequined gown bunching up awkwardly around her trembling legs. The illusion of her perfect suburban dynasty was dead. The sprawling mansion she used to dominate her social circle was gone. Her golden boy was a handcuffed felon. She crawled desperately toward the federal detectives, sobbing real agonizing tears of absolute despair. There were no more fake church tears to manipulate the congregation. This was genuine, suffocating terror. She reached out with a trembling hand, trying to grab the edge of the lead detective's trench coat. "He is a good boy," Beatrice babbled incoherently, mascara running down her cheeks in dark, thick streaks. "We are an important family. You cannot do this to us. We belong at the country club. My son is a brilliant lawyer. There has been a terrible mistake." One of the uniformed police officers gently but firmly pushed her back, stepping between her and the detective. The harsh physical rejection finally cemented the reality of her situation. Her social status meant absolutely nothing. Her church titles meant nothing. She collapsed into a pathetic weeping heap of cheap sequins and misery, realizing she was going to be homeless in the morning. The detectives grabbed Julian by his arms and began hauling him roughly toward the main exit. He struggled uselessly, his expensive leather shoes dragging awkwardly against the polished marble floor. He was shivering, terrified, and completely broken. As they dragged him down the center aisle, he twisted his neck to look back at the stage. He looked past the flashing red and blue lights, past his screaming sister-in-law, and past his weeping mother on the floor. He locked eyes with me. I was standing perfectly still at the clear acrylic podium, radiant in my custom sapphire gown, completely untouched by the absolute ruin consuming his life. Desperation entirely took over his fractured mind. He abandoned his pride, his arrogance, and his ego. He played his last, most pathetic card, trying to leverage the only thing he thought I still cared about. "Please!" Gab Julian screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror as the detectives dragged him further away. "Please, we are a family. Help me. For the twins." 3 months later, the brutal Chicago winter finally surrendered to a bright, forgiving spring. The sensational scandal that had erupted on the floor of the museum ballroom still dominated the local headlines, but the people involved had already met their inevitable fates. The federal justice system moved with terrifying, ruthless efficiency when the victims of fraud were powerful billionaires and politicians. Julian did not even make it to a trial. His defense attorney took one look at the overwhelming mountain of financial evidence, the forged signatures, the illegally diverted funds, and the crystal-clear audio recordings of his confession, and advised him to accept a plea deal. Julian now resides in a federal correctional institution, far from the glittering skyscrapers of the city he once thought he conquered. The man who used to spend hours obsessing over the precise break of his Italian trousers and the polished shine of his leather Oxfords now wears an oversized faded khaki jumpsuit. His days of commanding boardrooms and intimidating junior associates are completely over. His reality is now dictated by harsh fluorescent lighting, blaring metal buzzers, and the cold, sterile concrete of a 6 by 8 foot cell. He works in the prison laundry room, earning mere cents an hour, folding the exact kind of cheap linens he once mocked his own mother for buying. The crushing weight of his absolute irrelevance is his true punishment. He is no longer the golden boy. He is just another number in the system, completely forgotten by the powerful elite he sacrificed his freedom to impress. No one comes to visit him. Beatrice suffered a fate that in her eyes was significantly worse than federal prison. The morning after the gala, the bank executed the foreclosure on her sprawling suburban estate, exactly as the documents had promised. She was physically escorted off the snow-covered property by armed sheriff deputies clutching a single cardboard box of personal items. Her social destruction was absolute and instantaneous. The wealthy congregation she had ruled with pious superiority immediately excommunicated her. They deleted her number, blocked her on social media, and acted as though she had never existed. Today, Beatrice works a minimum wage retail job at a discount home goods store on the far outskirts of the city. The woman who once hosted catered country club luncheons now spends her days wearing a stiff polyester blue vest, sweeping up broken plastic merchandise and organizing clearance bins. Occasionally, women from her former social circle wander into the store looking for cheap holiday decorations. When they see her pushing a broom down the aisle, they do not stop to say hello. They simply avert their eyes and walk quickly in the other direction, treating her with the exact same cold disdain she had weaponized against others for decades. Alicia and Preston did not even have the financial resources required to finalize a divorce. The frozen assets and the towering legal fees from the federal investigation completely drained whatever pathetic remnants of cash they had hidden away. They are now permanently trapped together in a suffocating, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a decaying building next to a busy, elevated train line. The walls are paper-thin, the linoleum floors are peeling, and the radiator clanks violently throughout the night. Preston spends his days sitting on a sagging thrift store sofa, desperately scrolling through his phone, trying to scheme his way into new investment circles. But his name is absolute poison. He has been blacklisted from every venture capital firm and country club in the state. Alicia sits across from him in the tiny kitchen, staring blankly at her chipped, unmanicured nails. The fake diamond jewelry and the leased luxury cars are distant memories, replaced by the smell of cheap microwave dinners and the sound of rattling pipes. They spend their evenings screaming at each other, their voices echoing down the dingy hallway, bound together not by love, but by mutual hatred and inescapable poverty. Far above the grime and the noise of their ruined lives, I sit in the expansive living room of my sunlit downtown penthouse. The heavy winter clouds have cleared, allowing brilliant golden sunlight to pour through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The light warms the rich hardwood floors and illuminates the pristine, elegant space I built entirely with my own hands. From the kitchen, I can hear the beautiful, chaotic sound of the twins laughing. They are chasing each other around the kitchen island, their small feet padding softly against the floor, safe, secure, and completely untouched by the toxic family that tried to destroy us. I take a slow sip of my premium dark roast coffee, letting the rich warmth settle into my chest. I set the ceramic mug down on my sleek glass desk and turn my attention back to the glowing screen of my laptop. I am not reviewing corporate acquisitions or analyzing stock portfolios today. I am looking at the future. I am personally reviewing application files for a brand new technology incubator program that I have fully funded with my own capital. It is a multi-million-dollar initiative specifically designed to support, fund, and elevate young Black female software developers. I spent my entire career fighting for a single seat at a table controlled by men who looked right past me. I endured their doubts, their condescension, and their constant attempts to minimize my brilliance. I am no longer asking for a seat at their table. I have built my own table, and I am pulling out chairs for the women who are just like me. The applicants I am reviewing are brilliant, hungry, and completely fearless. They just need the capital and the protection to build their empires, and I am going to give them both. I close the laptop, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. I stand up from my desk and walk over to the towering glass windows. I look out over the breathtaking expanse of the Chicago skyline. The towering skyscrapers of glass and steel stretch out for miles, gleaming brightly against the crystal-clear blue sky. The dark, icy waters of Lake Michigan ripple gently in the distance, reflecting the brilliant morning sun. I look down at the bustling city below me, completely unbothered by the cold memory of the people who tried to drag me down. They are gone. The parasites have been purged and the winter has finally passed. I did not just survive the storm, I own the city. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true power does not come from projecting a fake image or tearing others down to elevate yourself. Real strength is forged in silence through hard work, absolute independence, and unbreakable integrity. Those who build their empires on lies and manipulation will inevitably watch them crumble into dust, while those who survive the storm can build a new legacy entirely on their own terms. Have you ever had to stand your ground against toxic people who deeply underestimated you? Share your own experiences in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of absolute unapologetic justice.